Hello, my name is Phillip Johnson. I'm an Associate Professor at University College Dublin. I am also a Senior Visiting Fellow at Queen Mary, and I'm the author of the London International Programme's IP and Sport course. And I'm also the author of the textbook, or the main textbook, which is used in the course. Now, the course covers 4 different sections, and each section covers an aspect of intellectual property and sport. The first section, Section A, relates to branding and sport, and we'll look at things like trademarks, copyright, image rights, and things like that, which give you a broad understanding of the legal framework in which IP, or the IP framework in which the sporting markets work. It also gives you a bit of an understanding of the sport market generally and the sort of value of some of these things. Section B is the section which deals with sponsorship itself. So it looks at the sort of relationships that might exist between a sponsorer and a sponsoree, and it also looks at the sort of the fact you can have primary sponsors and secondary sponsors, and how different events might benefit from sponsorship and how different events might interrelate with sponsorship. It also looks at some of the restrictions on sponsorship. In recent years, there's been moves to try and stop things to do with the sponsorship by tobacco companies or sponsorship by alcohol, and there's been questions about things like fast food. And so these sorts of issues are looked at in Section B. So it's how sponsorship works, and indeed what can be done with sponsorship and who can and can't sponsor. Section 3 is about ambush marketing. Now, ambush marketing is a relatively new concept. It's a concept which started or became prominent probably around the turn of the millennium. And the idea is it's where people take advantage of a sporting event without paying sponsorship. So one of the classic examples of ambush marketing would be where American Express said for the Lillehammer Games in 1994 that you don't need a visa to go to Lillehammer. Now, that was because Visa was a sponsor of the Lillehammer Games, and saying you don't need a visa was a way of drawing an association with the Games without actually mentioning the name. And that idea of ambush marketing is something which is explored quite in detail in Part 3. Now, one of the things about Section C is that it's changed a little since the guide. The guide was written in 2009, before we had the London Olympics, and the United Kingdom had quite a lot of legislation for at preventing ambush marketing for the London Olympic Games. So that's discussed in the guide and in the book, but there's also things which have moved on in other areas. So other countries, for example, have now adopted what we like to call generic anti-ambush marketing laws. So they are also dealt with in the book. And you look at countries like New Zealand and Australia and seeing how they've dealt with it as well. The 4th section is what I've called special topics in sport, and this sort of deals with issues which are slightly more discrete, slightly more separate from other things. So it'll look at things like ticketing regulations, because there are restrictions on buying and selling tickets for major events. The reason for that is, of course, to try and ensure that you can't use pass tickets on and make huge profits for them in one way, but it's also to try and ensure that you can't give them away and use them as a prize and try and take an advantage of an event in that way. Section D also looks at broadcasting, and Section D, broadcasting is particularly challenging because in some countries, such as the United Kingdom, there's no such thing as a broadcasting right as such. And so many sports organisations try and come up with a way of commercialising their broadcasting right without that discrete and separate right. And they do this through a collection of rights. Things like real property laws, the right to enter a stadium and so on can be very important to protect your broadcasting right. There is a copyright in the broadcast itself, the stream that is sent. And the chapter in Section D looks at that idea of what broadcasting is, how broadcasting can be protected. It also gives you some examples of jurisdictions where there are actually specific broadcasting rights. In Australia, for example, certain countries, or certain states in Australia, I should say, have specific protection for events, so that you have to pay to broadcast an event at a fixed amount. And if you don't have, if you broadcast in contravention of that rule, you have to pay that fixed amount. It's a way of creating a broadcasting right. The chapter also looks at things to do with counterfeiting and parallel trade. Now, this is a more general IP topic, but one which is particularly important in relation to intellectual property in sport, because you can buy merchandising in one country and then resell it in another. So, for example, if you were to buy a top for Arsenal, a famous football club in London, and you bought it in France, could you bring that top from France into London and resell it? Or, if that top is not actually produced legitimately by Arsenal, but is produced by a counterfeiter, is there a way of stopping it getting within the United Kingdom, or more particularly within the European Union? So that's something else which is also looked at in Chapter 4. The other thing looked at in Section D relates to restrictions on advertising. Now, in the context of advertising generally, there are voluntary codes which regulate what you can and cannot say. And some of these have been integrated into a wider picture of controlling the advertising message from sporting events and sports stars. And this section looks at that more generally. It also is possible to look at some countries which has much more detailed provisions to control advertising, such as South Africa. I hope you enjoy the course, and if you want to learn more about each of the individual sections, then there's a separate video on Section A, Section B, Section C, and of course Section D.